At age 53, Grant Hill stands there as a living paradox of American basketball, a man who once possessed nearly everything an athlete could dream of, yet serves as the clearest proof that greatness does not equate to wholeness. He entered the NBA in 1994 and was immediately handed the Rookie of the Year title by the entire country, becoming the new face of the league in a moment when basketball was desperately searching for a successor to an era that had just ended. Grant Hill quickly became a 7-time NBA All-Star, earned spots on all NBA teams, and was one of those rare all-around players who could score, pass, rebound, and control the game's tempo with astonishing calm. Before that, at Duke, he won the NCAA championship twice, not just as a court star, but as a moral exemplar of American college sports. Disciplined, intelligent, scandal-free, never rebellious. He appeared on magazine covers, in global ad campaigns, and was built by the NBA as the face of the future, a clean, perfect, reliable icon. Later, when his career had been torn apart by time and pain, he was still inducted into the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame, not for championship rings or flashy stats, but for the stature of a man once chosen to carry the expectations of an entire sport. But this story does not exist to rehash those accomplishments. It exists to pose a far colder question. What happens when a person is chosen to stand firm in place of millions of hopes, yet is not allowed to fall, even as life quietly takes pieces of him away? Grant Hill did not collapse in one dramatic moment, did not vanish because of a mistake, did not single-handedly destroy his own career. He was worn down, slowly and silently. Each passing year took away another part of his body that no longer responded to his will, erased another piece of his future in silence, while the world still demanded he maintain that image of strength and composure. This is not a story about injuries, in the usual sense, not just ankles, surgeries, or cold medical reports, but a story about a life being slowly drained while it still existed. Grant Hill was not allowed to complain of pain because he was the role model. He was not allowed to give up because he represented the perfection America once believed in. And that very fact crushed him in the cruelest way, not with one single fall, but with a prolonged stripping away over many years. Age 53 does not mark a tragic end, but it forces people to pause and face this truth. Some people are not born to fall, yet they pay a lifetime price for always standing tall, and Grant Hill's story does not come to comfort. It comes to expose the quiet cost of being chosen. If the story of Grant Hill has touched you, please hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapters of this journey, full of loss but proud. Born into a family where prestige was not a choice but a default, Grant Hill entered life with a name already carrying the weight of expectation. His father, Calvin Hill, was an NFL legend, a Super Bowl champion, a man who walked the pinnacle of American sports with calm demeanor and iron discipline. In that household, success was not celebrated with loud applause, but assumed as a duty to be fulfilled. Failure was not punished with whips, but covered by a silence heavier than any scolding. Grant Hill grew up within walls of standards, where every behavior had to be proper, every emotion had to be controlled, where a child learned that being loved did not come with weakness. His father's shadow did not need to weigh him down through direct comparison. It was present in every meal, every question about discipline, every expectant glance. Grant Hill soon understood that, to be respected in this family, he had to be steady, self-reliant, able to stand straight without leaning on anyone. No one taught him how to cry out in pain, because crying out meant admitting he wasn't strong enough. No one encouraged him to show fear, because fear had no place in a lineage accustomed to victory. And so, very early, Grant Hill learned a skill more important than any athletic technique: silence. Silence when tired, silence when hurt, silence when feeling he couldn't keep up with expectations. That silence was not imposed on him, he chose it himself, because it was the safest way to survive in a world where weakness was never named. At school, Grant Hill was not the loud or rebellious kid. He was diligent, calm, rarely caused trouble. Adults looked at him and saw a perfect boy, a source of pride. But inside that perfection was a child teaching himself how to endure without help, learning to turn every pressure into inner strength, believing that if he tried hard enough, all pain would simply disappear. That way of growing up forged in Grant Hill a rare resilience, but at the same time planted the seeds for later tragedy. Because when you get used to not crying out in pain, you also forget how to ask for help. When you're taught never to be weak, you won't know what to do when your body and soul finally can't stand firm. Grant Hill entered adulthood with a character that America admired. Disciplined, humble, responsible, scandal-free, but at the same time, he carried a dangerous gap, a void where help should have existed. In Grant Hill's world, strength was not a choice. It was mandatory, and that very mandate ensured he never learned to say he was in pain, that he was tired, that he couldn't carry everything alone. The seeds of tragedy did not appear through one big event, but through the habit of silence stretched across his childhood, through the belief that a real man must stand on his own even if no one holds him up. Looking back, it's painfully clear that Grant Hill's tragedy did not begin on the court. He did not start with injury or failure. It began the very moment he learned to swallow his pain and believe that was the only way to be worthy of the name he carried. Duke was not just a college in Grant Hill's life. Duke was where the silence he brought from his family was sharpened into discipline, where emotions were not forbidden but placed under strict control by goals and honor. When Grant Hill stepped into Duke University in the early 1990s, he did not merely join a basketball program. He entered a system of belief, where winning was not a reward, but a moral obligation. At Duke, players were not taught to stand out with ego, but to blend into the collective, to sacrifice personal desires for something greater than themselves. For Grant Hill, this was not unfamiliar. It felt like a perfect continuation of how he had been raised. He did not resist, did not doubt, did not question. He complied, he listened, he did it right. Duke quickly recognized in Grant Hill a rare type of player, talented, intelligent, calm, and above all, absolutely reliable. In that environment, Grant Hill learned that being loved did not come from showing weakness, but from enduring in silence and still completing the task. Every long practice, every tense game, every strict demand was accepted as an inevitable part of the path to becoming a perfect person. Duke taught him that victory was not free. It demanded sacrifice, and the more silent that sacrifice, the more noble it was. Grant Hill became the ideal embodiment of that philosophy. He was not the loudest star, not the highest scorer in every game, but the one who always showed up at the right moment, did the right thing, and rarely made mistakes. The two NCAA championships not only etched his name into Duke history, but reinforced the image of a perfect Grant Hill in America's eyes. The model athlete, the excellent student, the flawless human being. The media praised him as the symbol of rightness, of that rare balance between talent and ethics. But within that praise, an invisible pressure was placed on his shoulders. The perfection Duke created left no room for error, allowed no wavering, and certainly no collapse. Grant Hill understood very clearly that at Duke, a mistake was not just personal, it was a betrayal of collective trust. So he tightened himself even more, learned to hide fatigue even better, pushed his limits a little further each day. No one saw him cry out in pain. No one heard him complain. And Duke, in its rightful pride, never asked whether that silence was strength or an unspoken cry for help. Grant Hill left Duke with everything a young player could dream of: titles, respect, and a spotless reputation. But he also left with a belief deeply ingrained. that his worth was tied to his ability to endure, that to be loved and respected, he must keep sacrificing, keep standing tall, keep refusing to allow himself to err. Duke had turned Grant Hill into a perfect icon, and America was ready to embrace that icon. There was just one thing no one noticed in time. Perfection, built on not allowing mistakes, also means not preparing for failure, not preparing for pain, and not preparing for the moment when body and fate finally refuse to obey the discipline humans have imposed on them. Stepping out of Duke, Grant Hill didn't just carry titles and respect with him, he carried a destiny that America had hastily written in advance. The 1994 NBA Draft was not simply an event for selecting talent. It was the moment when the entire league was panicking in silence. Michael Jordan had just left the stage, leaving behind a colossal void not just in skill, but in symbolism, in narrative, in someone for the public to cling to. America didn't need another good player. America needed a successor. And Grant Hill, with his perfect Duke resume, his gentle face, calm demeanor, all-around talent, and spotless ethics, was placed exactly in that spot the moment his name was called. The Detroit Pistons selected Grant Hill not just to rebuild a team, but to rebuild faith. Right in his rookie season, he answered every expectation with the Rookie of the Year award, rare all-around numbers, and moments that had people whispering that this was the future of the NBA. But from that very second, the NBA no longer gave Grant Hill the chance to grow naturally. The NBA imposed an invisible sentence on him. You must carry the load, right now. Every game Grant Hill played was no longer just playing. It became a duty to the fans, to television, to a league starving for an icon. Every sprint he made carried the message that he was the chosen one, that he was not allowed to fade, not allowed to slow down, and certainly not allowed to fail. The media didn't say Grant Hill had the potential to become a star. They spoke as if he already was that star, and all he had to do was keep standing tall. And Grant Hill, the man who had grown up accustomed to silent endurance, did not resist that burden. He accepted it as an inevitable part of the role he had been assigned. He played not just to win, but to not disappoint anyone. It was in that environment that the concept of pain began to be distorted. The first pains were not seen as warning signals, but as the price to be paid. The aches and fatigue after games were not reasons to stop, but proof of dedication. Grant Hill was not taught to listen to his body. He was taught to overcome it. Every ache had to be hidden, because a successor could not afford to show fragility. The NBA kept pushing him forward. The Pistons kept building around him, and the public kept consuming the image of Grant Hill as an tireless icon. In that whirlwind, no one had time to ask whether the human inside that icon had enough space to breathe. Grant Hill became one of the most closely watched players in the league. Every movement dissected, every expectation raised higher. And the higher the expectations, the more he forced himself to be perfect. He played more minutes, shouldered more responsibility, always appearing as the calm leader the team needed. But no one saw the moments he walked into the locker room in silence, the times his body first sent signals of resistance. In the NBA, there is no room for hesitation when you've been chosen as the icon. Grant Hill understood that very clearly. He understood that just one slowdown, one admission that he wasn't ready, and the story America needed would collapse. And so, he kept going, kept enduring, kept playing the role of the one who never tires. Grant Hill's tragedy did not begin with a clear fall, but with a series of very human decisions. The decision not to speak up, not to stop, not to disappoint anyone. The NBA did not directly injure him, but the system of expectations the NBA built gradually stripped away his right to be weak. From the moment he entered the league, Grant Hill was no longer allowed to be a player, still learning. He was forced to be the answer to an entire sport's anxiety. And it was right here, when every game became a duty and every pain became a secret, that Grant Hill's tragedy officially began. Not loudly, not with warning, but inevitably. At the Detroit Pistons, Grant Hill finally touched what America calls the peak. But it was a peak so fragile that he himself didn't realize he was standing on the edge of an abyss. The rookie season ended with the Rookie of the Year award, an official confirmation that every expectation had been placed correctly. Grant Hill became an all-star not just once, but year after year, his name appearing regularly in the most prestigious teams and the most respected polls. The Pistons were no longer a group fumbling for direction. They had a new center, a guide, with a calm face and a rare all-around game. Grant Hill scored, passed, rebounded, defended, led, did everything the team needed, and did it with such precision that people believed he was born to carry this responsibility. But that peak was not built on short bursts of brilliance. It was built on constant presence, on Grant Hill always being on the court, always ready, always taking the hardest tasks. He played for the team because the Pistons needed him there in every critical situation. He played for the image because the entire league had cast him as the successor, the representative of a clean, principled, reliable NBA. And above all, he played because he was not allowed to stop, because stopping would mean admitting that the icon America had built could get tired, could get hurt, could not be ready. In those years, Grant Hill was almost never absent. He played heavy minutes, carried heavy loads, bore responsibilities that should have been shared. Every game ended, he walked out with his familiar composure, but his body began recording things the lights didn't reach. Lingering pains appeared. At first, just gentle reminders that limits exist. But for Grant Hill, limits were not things to listen to. They were things to overcome. He was not the type of player who sought attention by complaining or resting. He chose silence, kept training, kept playing, kept fulfilling the role of the model leader. Whenever anyone asked about his condition, the answer was always that everything was fine, because, in the world he lived in, fine was the only acceptable answer. The Pistons needed him, the NBA needed him, and the image of Grant Hill needed to remain intact. His peak, therefore, was not a single glorious moment remembered forever, but a prolonged period where he was continuously required to maintain perfection. And that prolonged perfection began to wear down his body mercilessly. There was no warning fall, no loud crack to alert anyone, just mornings waking up heavier, runs less fluid, pains taking longer to fade. Grant Hill saw those signs, but he did not allow himself to stop and think about them, because stopping would mean breaking the rhythm that an entire team and an entire league were relying on. He kept playing with near absolute devotion, turning his body into a tool to fulfill invisible duties. That peak, from the outside, was the brightest phase of Grant Hill's career, but from the inside, it was the moment his body began paying the price for his spirit's excessive kindness, for always putting responsibility above himself. Grant Hill had no idea he was living in the last free years of his body, that every passing game not only brought him closer to glory, but also closer to the moment his body would speak in a way he could no longer ignore. That peak became short, not because of a lack of talent or desire, but because it was built on a man who never allowed himself to stop, a man who believed enduring was duty, and that very belief quietly opened the door to the tragedy to come. When Grant Hill left Detroit to sign the blockbuster contract with the Orlando Magic, it was not just a trade, it was a promise whispered across the entire league. Grant Hill arrived in Orlando as the savior, the one expected to pull a young but wayward team out of mediocrity's shadow and straight onto the NBA power map. The city craved a new icon, a face clean enough, talented enough, trustworthy enough to represent the future. Grant Hill met every criterion. He brought not the arrogance of a flashy star, but the demeanor of a quiet leader, a man people believed would do everything right. That contract was signed not just with money, but with the belief that Orlando finally had someone to pin long-term hopes on. But it was right there in the promised land of redemption that Grant Hill's dream began to be nailed shut, one slow, painful nail at a time. The ankle that had already spoken up during his Detroit years now became the center of all instability. At first, it was just the familiar pains, the kind Grant Hill had learned to accept as part of the job. He kept playing, kept training, kept maintaining the image of a tireless leader. But Orlando didn't need a Grant Hill who was trying. Orlando needed a perfect Grant Hill, and the gap between the two grew increasingly cruel. When the decision for surgery was made, it was viewed as a necessary temporary setback to protect the future. Grant Hill believed it. The team believed it. The fans believed it. But his body did not. The surgery did not bring the expected recovery, and what followed was not a healing process, but a series of failed experiments on his own body. Every return to practice was a lesson in relearning trust in his ankle, and each time, that trust grew more fragile. Grant Hill stepped onto the court with unprecedented caution, every sprint carrying the fear that one wrong move could erase whatever remained. But he still played, because the role of savior did not allow him to step back. Orlando had not just signed Grant Hill, they had signed the image he represented, and that image could not sit on the bench for too long. His comebacks were initially welcomed with hope, applause, and optimistic articles. But hope is the easiest thing to drain when it is constantly betrayed. Each time Grant Hill returned, he no longer ran as fast, no longer exploded like before, and most importantly, no longer trusted his body like before. The ankle didn't just hurt, it became a constant obsession, a reminder that everything could collapse at any moment. Surgeries followed one after another, endless rehabilitation regimens, training sessions he had to stop midway because pain suddenly surged. Grant Hill gradually realized he was no longer fighting to return to the peak, but fighting to hold on to the right to keep playing at all. And that was a painful truth for someone once seen as the future of an entire league. With each injury comeback, the eyes of fans and media changed. Initial excitement gave way to caution, then gradually to doubt. Grant Hill was no longer asked when he would dominate, but when he would truly be healthy again. And that question had no clear answer. He tried adjusting his game, slowing down, relying more on skill and basketball IQ, but his body would not let him forget the new limits. Orlando gradually had to learn to exist without Grant Hill, and Grant Hill had to learn to accept that the team built around him was looking for other options. There was no official moment marking the collapse of the Orlando dream, no tearful final game, just the exhausting prolongation of failed recoveries, of hopes lit and then snuffed out. Grant Hill kept his familiar calm demeanor, answered interviews with careful words, still said he believed in the process, but inside, each return forced him to face the truth that he had lost something irrecoverable. The Orlando dream did not die in one tragic moment. It was nailed shut slowly. One surgery, one cautious step, one less complete comeback after another. And in that process, Grant Hill did not just lose the peak career. America once expected he lost the sense of safety in his own body. Orlando had been promised as a place of rebirth, but it ended up becoming the clearest exposure of the fragility of a man too accustomed to enduring. Each time Grant Hill stepped onto the court in a Magic jersey, hope was still there, but smaller, more fragile, and carrying the fear that this might be the last time. And it was in that cruel repetition that the dream an entire city had pinned its hopes on, gradually closed, not with a slamming door, but with the heartbreaking creak of nails driven deep into a future that never had the chance to bloom. What happened after Orlando was no longer just a sad chapter in Grant Hill's athletic career. It was the moment when the boundary between profession and survival began to blur in a terrifying way. The ankle that had once only ached quietly now became a suspended sentence, never publicly declared, but present in every medical decision, every worried doctor's glance. Bone infection emerged like an invisible enemy, seeping deep into his body, destroying not with speed, but with cold persistence. It was no longer a story about when he could return to the court, but a question of whether he could even continue walking as a normal human being. Grant Hill began months of prolonged antibiotic infusions, treatments where every needle piercing his vein reminded him that his body was fighting something far beyond basketball. Treatments followed one after another, tense checkups, and medical conversations behind closed doors, where words like spreading, risk, amputation were spoken with suffocating caution. At times, the risk of losing his leg was no longer a distant hypothesis, but a serious possibility being weighed to save his life. For a man who had once lived through movement, who had defined himself by his ability to run, jump, and control his body, that prospect was not just fear, it was the erasure of his entire identity. But during that period, Grant Hill did not tell this story to the world. He did not speak to the press, did not share with the public what was happening in the hospital room, did not allow his image to become an emotional tragedy for consumption. He also did not complain to teammates, because in his mind, everyone had their own battles, and he did not want to become a burden or a reminder of how fragile peak sports could be. Even more terrifying, there were things he dared not say to his family, not out of distrust, but because he feared seeing fear in the eyes of those he loved. Grant Hill chose to carry that horror alone, as he had done his entire life, believing silence was the only way to shield those around him from a truth too heavy to bear. Every day in the hospital stretched like mental torture, where he faced absolute helplessness. There were no drills to push through, no strategies to apply, no willpower strong enough to command the bacteria to stop. This was no longer sports, where you could train more, try harder, endure more pain to reclaim your place. This was survival, where everything depended on factors beyond control, where the body no longer obeyed the commands of the mind. Grant Hill, once praised for his resilience and discipline, had to learn to lie still and wait, had to learn to entrust his fate to others. That was a painful humbling for a man who had always believed in standing on his own. In those long hospital nights, when the sound of machines replaced the roar of crowds, Grant Hill did not think about titles or legacy. He thought about the most basic things, whether he could walk normally again, whether he could play with his children, whether he could live a life not defined by pain. Those questions were never spoken aloud, but they repeated in his mind like an unpronounced sentence already felt. Outside, the basketball world kept spinning. Seasons came and went. New stars emerged. New stories were told. Grant Hill faded from that rhythm, not with an official retirement announcement or a formal farewell moment, but through a prolonged, heavy, hard-to-explain absence. Some said he was unlucky. Others began questioning whether he could ever return. But very few knew that, at that time, the most important question was not whether he could return to the court, but whether he could hold on to himself. Grant Hill faced the truth that every quality once praised his silence, his endurance, his refusal to complain, had now become both strength and burden. They kept him from collapsing in public, but also left him alone in his greatest fear. When the ankle became a sentence, Grant Hill had no public trial, no audience, no defense, just him, his body, and a silent battle whose outcome no one dared predict. This was no longer a story about losing a great career. It was a story about holding on to the right to continue existing as a whole human being. And in that silence, Grant Hill kept living, kept enduring, not to prove anything to the world, but to cross the fragile line between once being an icon and still being able to step into tomorrow. After months of battling infection and the silent terror of possibly losing his own legs, Grant Hill returned to the basketball world not with a glorious comeback moment, but with a heartbreakingly faint presence. There was no retirement announcement, no farewell press conference, no ceremony to close a chapter once seen as the future of an entire league. His career did not end with a clear period, but with prolonged silences so extended that people gradually grew accustomed to no longer mentioning him. Grant Hill did not vanish overnight. He faded slowly, like a once familiar name mentioned less and less. The NBA kept moving forward at its usual speed. New seasons opened, younger, healthier faces, with fewer scars appeared, and quickly took the space Grant Hill once occupied. No one deliberately pushed him out, but no one stopped to wait for him either. In a league where presence determines value, prolonged absence became its own answer. Grant Hill entered the most terrifying limbo of a great athlete. Not retired, but no longer belonging to the present. He was no longer the center of any plan, no longer the name teams built around, no longer the story the media needed to tell. Trade rumors, discussions about the NBA's future happened without him, as if his existence had become part of a past no longer worth mentioning. The cruelest part was not criticism or doubt, but being replaced quietly. Grant Hill watched other players take on roles once earmarked for him, watched new hopes, built with the same excitement he once received, and understood that the league's wheel never stops for one individual, no matter how irreplaceable that individual once seemed. He did not resist it, did not speak out demanding recognition or pity. He stayed silent, as he had his entire life, and that very silence made his disappearance almost invisible. In locker rooms, conversations continued without him. On practice courts, drills were designed for other bodies. In the memories of younger fans, Grant Hill gradually became a name mentioned as a hypothetical, as an if-only, rather than a reality that once existed. His career died that way slowly, not in immediate agony but in persistent, nagging discomfort, like having small pieces of identity stripped away without a chance to fight back. Grant Hill was still there, still training when he could, still hoping for comebacks, but each time hope was kindled, it was extinguished faster than before, and each time, the distance between him and the current NBA grew a little wider. There was no funeral for Grant Hill's career because no one officially declared it over. But that very fact made the pain vague and prolonged. No moment to cry, no day to accept, no ritual to close. Just the cold continuation of time, where he had to learn to exist on the sidelines of a world that once saw him as the center. Grant Hill became an unwilling observer of the very dream once promised to him. He watched the NBA grow, expand, become flashier, wealthier, while his story receded into the background. No one hated him, but no one needed him anymore, and that was a form of forgetting more painful than any criticism. Forgotten while still alive, left behind as history's wheel kept rolling, Grant Hill had to face the truth that his career was not closed with glory or public tragedy, but with a silent disappearance where he still existed as a person, but was no longer seen as part of the present. In that void, Grant Hill did not collapse, but he also no longer had a place to stand as firmly as before. He carried memories of the days he was the center, faced a present where his name was called less and less, and understood that some tragedies need no tears or spotlights because they unfold in prolonged indifference, where a career once expected to change an entire era closed almost without anyone noticing. When Grant Hill's career quietly slipped into an unnamed silence, his personal life also moved into an even crueler chapter, where the pain no longer belonged to just one person. Tamia, the woman he loved, the partner who had walked with him into marriage during his peak years, was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a quiet but relentless autoimmune disease that doesn't kill instantly, but gnaws away day by day. MS didn't arrive like an accident, didn't appear with a clear shock. It crept in silently, leaving unexplained fatigue, pain, moments when the body no longer obeyed the will. For Tamia, The disease was a sentence without a specific execution date. For Grant Hill, it was the moment he realized his battle had never been just his own. In their home, there were no loud cries, no words blaming fate. There were mornings when both woke up in pain, in different ways, and had to look at each other in silence, wondering who would be the stronger one today. Grant Hill, who had once been unable to walk because of his ankle, who had once had to hold onto walls to take small steps, became a support for his wife. There were days he cared for Tamia while he himself could barely stand, the two leaning on each other not with physical strength, but with quiet endurance. They did not turn their pain into a story to tell the press, did not use illness as an emotional shield in front of the public. In their world, enduring was not a heroic epic. It was simply what had to be done so they could keep living the next day. A family where both adults carried invisible wounds, yet still kept the home atmosphere peaceful enough so the children wouldn't feel that burden. Grant Hill did not allow himself to collapse, because if he fell, Tamia would have no support. Tamia did not allow herself to stay weak for too long, because she knew the man beside her was also fighting his own limits. They loved each other not with grand promises, but with persistent presence in the hardest moments. But love, no matter how deep, cannot erase pain. It can only help people endure it better. Grant Hill once faced days when even walking was a challenge, while still learning how to care for a woman gradually losing control of her body. Tamia once had to stand on stage, keep singing, keep smiling, while inside was the anxiety of not knowing how much her body would betray her tomorrow. They did not beg for pity, did not seek attention. In a culture that often celebrates victory and recovery, they chose the least celebrated path, living with pain without demanding reward. This is a moral tragedy, because neither of them did anything wrong. There was no mistake to fix, no wrong decision to regret, just the raw truth that sometimes life places burdens on those already accustomed to carrying them. Grant Hill and Tamia became a family that did not complain, did not beg, only endured, not because they were stronger than others, but because they saw no other choice. In those long nights, when the lights went out, and the outside world no longer looked at them, the pain was more present than ever. But even then, they still chose to stay together, chose not to turn their suffering into an accusation against fate. Grant Hill learned to love without expecting salvation, learned to understand that some battles cannot be won, only walked through together. And it was in that unshowy endurance that their tragedy became deeper than any collapse on the court. This was no longer a story about an athlete losing his career. It was a story about two grown people simultaneously learning to live with the truth that love does not always heal, that sometimes all love can do is keep people from being alone as the pain continues to exist. When the biggest storm of his personal life finally began to subside, Grant Hill stepped out once more to face the world, not to return to the peak, but to realize a truth even colder than the pain. Time does not wait for kind people. Grant Hill carried no scandal, no controversy, left behind no stories of mistakes needing forgiveness. He lived so properly that there was nothing to headline, and that very fact made him invisible in a culture always craving noise. No one attacked Grant Hill, but no one waited for him either. No one hated him, but no one stopped to mourn. America moved on, carrying new stories, new faces, livelier new debates. In that flow, Grant Hill drifted to the sidelines, not pushed out, but left behind. His career had no moment for the public to collectively turn and look back, because there was nothing to condemn or pity. He was a good man, and good men rarely become the central story of an era. In conversations about the NBA, the name Grant Hill appeared as a small footnote, as an if-only reminder, then quickly passed over to make room for legends with clearer endings. No one denied his talent, but no one argued fiercely to defend him either. Grant Hill's kindness did not create headlines, because headlines need conflict, need public tragedy, need mistakes to dissect. He did not give the media what they needed, and so time quietly pushed him out of the center of the story. Grant Hill saw it, felt it, but did not react. He did not write a memoir to demand justice, did not appear on television to tell of injustice, did not criticize the system that once placed impossible expectations on his shoulders. He chose silence, as he had chosen his entire life. But this time, that silence was no longer discipline. It was a sign that he had understood the world owed him no explanation. America honors winners, and those who fall hard. Grant Hill belonged to neither group. He did not win enough to become an immortal icon, nor did he fall hard enough to become a cautionary tale. He was in the middle, where memory fades the most. And that is a very particular kind of tragedy. The tragedy of people who live right, do right, but are not favored by history to be remembered. Grant Hill kept living, kept working, kept raising his family, while the world gradually stopped mentioning him as part of the present. There was no moment when he was officially sidelined, just the feeling of being called less and less. In the arenas where he once was the center, children grew up without knowing the image of Grant Hill dominating. To them, he was just an old video clip, a story told with fading regret. And for Grant Hill, that hurt in a different way from injury or illness. It caused no physical pain, but it gnawed at the sense that he once belonged to something grand, and now no longer did. He did not resent it, because resentment would break the image of the man he had tried to keep his whole life. But deep down, perhaps he also understood that kindness does not protect you from being forgotten. It only protects you from becoming someone shameful. America moved on, and Grant Hill stood there, not bitter, not angry, just quietly accepting that some lives are not remembered with cheers or tears, but with a silent void. And it was in that void that his tragedy appeared clearer than ever. Not loss because of mistakes, but the fading of a good man in a world that rarely stops to value quiet goodness. When Grant Hill arrived in Phoenix, it was no longer a journey to reclaim glory, but a decision rooted in mental survival. He did not step into the locker room as a savior, no longer introduced as the face of the future or the center of every plan. The Phoenix Suns were not waiting for an explosive Grant Hill, and he himself was no longer chasing that image. The man who appeared at this point was a broken version, not completely shattered, but having lost the most important parts that once made him different. He no longer had the speed to tear through defenses, no longer the stamina to carry a team through 4 quarters, no longer a body that allowed him to take risks. But the most terrifying thing was not losing those things, but having to learn to accept that they would never come back. Grant Hill began playing with his mind, with positioning, with timely decisions instead of explosive moments. Every movement was calculated to avoid pain. Every run carried a clear awareness of his body's limits. He played in pain, but it was no longer pain hidden by stubbornness. It was pain acknowledged and carefully managed. Phoenix did not need him to be the center. They needed him as a stable piece in a collective that already had other stars. And for the first time in his career, Grant Hill did not resist that. He stepped back, yielded the spotlight, accepted that his role now was not to be cheered, but to help others shine. That acceptance did not come in a beautiful moment of enlightenment, but through quiet practices, games where he left the court with no one mentioning his name, evenings at home, with the feeling of having fulfilled his duty, but also realizing he was no longer the core of the story. Grant Hill learned to exist in that space, where value was no longer measured by points or magazine covers, but by the quiet trust of teammates and coaches. He became the pace setter, the advisor, the one who understood the game in a way only those who had been through both peak and abyss could. But living on with a broken version was never easy. There were nights after games when his body ached so much he couldn't sleep, when memories of years running freely returned like mockery, and Grant Hill had to face regrets no one else could share. He was no longer angry, no longer blaming fate, but he could not pretend everything was fine either. Phoenix gave him a place to keep playing basketball, but it could not return the feeling that he had once been the center of that world. And it was in that void that Grant Hill learned a cruel but necessary lesson. A person's value lies not only in being noticed, but in the ability to adapt when the lights go out. He accepted he was no longer the center, not because he wanted to, but because it was the only way to continue existing in a sport that had taken too much from him. Phoenix did not bring complete redemption, but it gave him a chance to close his career in a less painful way, to prove that even when broken, a person can still stand firm if he knows where he stands. Grant Hill did not recover his old self, but he built a new version, less flashy, less remembered, but more authentic. And in that journey, he no longer chased America's expectations, no longer shouldered the role of icon, but simply focused on playing basketball in the way his body still allowed. Living on with the broken version was not a victory, but for Grant Hill, it was a form of existence full of dignity, where he accepted loss without letting it define his entire self. When Grant Hill's name was called at the Hall of Fame, it was a moment the basketball world called glory, but for him, it felt like belated recognition for a life that had been taken too much from. Grant Hill stepped onto the podium, not as a champion, not carrying rings, not bearing memories of a fully realized prime to proudly recount. He stood there as a survivor, a man who had walked the entire road that should have been far more brilliant. The Hall of Fame is usually a place to recount victories, to tally glorious moments, to cite titles as final proof of greatness. But for Grant Hill, those things either did not exist or had been stolen before they could fully form. No NBA championship to hold high, no prolonged dominance phase to look back on with satisfaction, no sense of wholeness from having played in his best version long enough. And perhaps because of that, his speech did not focus on victories. Grant Hill did not talk much about the years of acclaim, did not list achievements, did not try to convince anyone he deserved it. He spoke about the pain, about the years struggling with a betraying body, about mornings waking up, not knowing if he could walk normally, about seasons passing in silence while he watched the basketball world continue without him. The Hall of Fame, in that moment, was no longer the peak of a career, but a place witnessing the rawest truth, that some are honored not for winning the most, but for enduring the longest. Grant Hill did not stand there to celebrate. He stood there to close a journey full of expectations, full of loss, and full of questions that would never have answers. When he mentioned his family, his wife, those who stayed by him in the worst years, people understood that this Hall of Fame was not for glorious moments, but for the painful years that did not kill him. There were no frenzied cheers like for champions, but a respectful silence, because everyone understood that before them stood a man who had paid with his entire career to keep his dignity. Grant Hill did not deny his regrets. He did not pretend everything went as expected. He acknowledged that his life had veered from the path America once drew for him, but it was in that acknowledgment that the Hall of Fame took on a different meaning, not a reward for what was achieved, but recognition for what was lost, without turning him bitter or resentful. Grant Hill's speech did not end with empty inspirational calls. It ended with a quiet feeling, forcing listeners to face the question of what true greatness really is. Is it championship rings, prolonged prime years, or the ability to keep stepping forward when everything that defined you has been stripped away? In that moment, the Hall of Fame was no longer a place to honor victory, but to acknowledge that some lives are never whole, yet still deserve respect. Grant Hill stepped off the stage with his familiar calm demeanor, not completely relieved, but no longer burdened with having to prove himself. Honoring a life that lost so much does not bring healing, but it allows the truth to stand straight, that Grant Hill is not remembered for what he won, but for the painful years he lived through without losing himself. After the Hall of Fame, when every title had been placed in its proper spot, and the biggest questions seemed to have found some response, Grant Hill stepped into another phase of his life, the phase of a man who had been stripped of nearly everything that once defined him, yet still had to learn how to keep living. Post-retirement, Grant Hill did not disappear completely, as many had feared. He appeared on television as a commentator, his voice calm, his analysis sharp, never bitter, never exaggerated. There, he no longer used his body to tell his story, he used his mind and his memories. Every insight, every tactical angle carried the trace of someone who had once been at the center, once on the sidelines, and once completely outside the game. He also stepped into leadership roles, involved in operations, contributing his voice to decisions that shaped the future of the sport that had once crushed him. Grant Hill did not try to reclaim the spotlight. He chose to stand in a position where his presence mattered, but did not create noise. There, he became a connector, a pace setter, someone who understood that lasting power does not come from cheers, but from long-term trust. Family became the true center of his life, not just a temporary support during the painful years, but the foundation. Grant Hill was present in the most ordinary moments: dinners, unhurried conversations, days when he did not have to prove anything to the world. He learned to enjoy quiet, something that had once been his greatest enemy. But even when everything was fine in the social sense, his body never truly healed. The lingering pains still returned on cold mornings, steps still required caution, seemingly harmless movements still carried risk. Grant Hill lived with a non-negotiable truth. There was no day when he completely forgot what his body had endured. No full recovery, no belated miracle, only management, acceptance, and continuation. The cruelest part was that, as time passed, the painful memories did not fade alongside the glorious ones. People might forget he was once the center of the NBA, but his body never forgot every surgery, every treatment round, every comeback that fell short. Grant Hill did not complain about it in public. He did not turn his pain into a brand, did not use it to demand sympathy, but in very private moments, when the quiet was loud enough, he knew exactly the price he had paid. Post-retirement, he was not redeemed by new roles. Commentating did not heal his body. Leadership did not erase memories. Family did not make the pain disappear. But all of those things gave him a reason to keep going, to put the pain in its proper place as a part of life that had passed, not the entirety of who he was. Grant Hill became the man after everything that once made him special had been taken away, and it was in that state that he learned the value of no longer having to chase expectations. He no longer needed to prove he was great. He only needed to prove he was still present, still kind, still able to contribute without hurting himself. His second career had no dazzling peaks, but it had endurance. It did not make people gasp in awe, but it made them trust him. And perhaps that was the balance life finally allowed him, not as a reward, but as a belated compromise. Grant Hill kept living, carrying a body that would never fully heal, but also carrying a rare calm, that after nearly everything had been taken, he still held on to the most important thing: the dignity of a man who refused to let pain decide who he was. At age 53, Grant Hill entered a phase that most people who once lived under the spotlight dread, the phase where there is nothing left to prove. No more scoreboards to climb, no more titles to chase, no more debates that must be won. And strangely, it was right there that his life became clearest. Grant Hill no longer had to win to exist. He had won enough in others' eyes long ago, and had lost enough to understand that winning and losing had never been the most important question. He no longer needed more love, no longer needed to be recalled as an unfinished icon, no longer needed defending in endless what-if arguments. Those debates had grown tiresome, and he was tired in a far deeper way than physical exhaustion. At this age, the only thing Grant Hill needed was not to collapse. Not to collapse under the memories of lost years. Not to collapse under the feeling that his life could have been different. Not to collapse under endless comparisons to paths he was never allowed to finish. Grant Hill learned to live with the what-if question without letting it turn into bitterness. He understood that if he kept looking back as someone robbed, he would betray himself, and betraying himself, to him, was the only unacceptable failure. Not betraying himself meant accepting the entire road traveled, both the brilliant stretches and the dark ones. Grant Hill did not sugarcoat the past, but he did not curse it either. He understood that the painful years had forced him to mature in ways easy victories never could. At age 53, he no longer sought external validation. Applause no longer made his heart race faster, and silence no longer made him anxious like before. Grant Hill lived slower, not because he was weaker, but because he finally had the right to choose his own pace. He spent time with family, with purposeless conversations, with mornings when his body needed to be listened to instead of forced. Each passing day was no longer measured by productivity or achievements, but by whether he was honest with his own feelings. Some days the body hurt more. Some days memories returned sharper. But Grant Hill did not run from those things. He did not use work, titles, or social roles to cover up the fragility of age and old wounds. Having nothing left to prove also meant having no reason to pretend. Grant Hill no longer had to act strong in front of anyone, but that did not mean he allowed himself to give up. On the contrary, his steadfastness now took a different form, steadfast in living true to the values that had kept him standing his entire life. Kindness, honesty, no exaggeration, no betrayal of those who stood by him when he was weakest, and most importantly, no betrayal of the man he had paid dearly to become. At age 53, Grant Hill understood that some victories go unrecorded, unhonored, yet they determine the quality of the rest of life. Victory over the temptation of bitterness. Victory over the need for recognition. Victory over the fear that without being the center, he would have no value. He chose to live as a whole person, rather than a frozen icon from the past. Grant Hill did not collapse, not because he never tired, but because he had learned to stand still without falling apart. And in a world that always demands more, always pushes people to prove their worth until their last breath, his choice carried a quiet but rare beauty. Having nothing left to prove was not an ending, it was a belated liberation. Grant Hill walked slowly through the rest of his life. No racing, no looking back, no need for confirmation. Just that with each passing day, he was still himself. And for Grant Hill, that was enough. And then, this story does not close with a moment of redemption. No miracle appears at the last minute. No dramatic resurrection to rewrite history in a more comforting way. No explanation strong enough to make all the losses feel rational. When all the lights have gone out, when the titles have fallen from his shoulders, when time no longer cares who he once was, what remains is Grant Hill, a man of flesh and blood who has walked a path very few can even imagine. He was not saved. No one stepped in at the right moment to give him back an intact body, a complete prime, or a career that fulfilled the original promise of fate. Grant Hill was not healed in the way America loves to tell in sports stories. No blazing comeback, no late championship, no moment when the entire arena stands to acknowledge that every pain was finally worth it. But he stood. He stood after speed was taken from him. He stood after the form of a star was taken from him. He stood after his career died slowly in silence. He stood when the woman he loved had to fight a disease with no promise of recovery. He stood when the world moved on without looking back. Grant Hill stood not as a winner, but as a human being who refused to collapse, even when there was no reason left to keep trying, except not to betray himself. He paid the full price for greatness, not with championship rings or years of dominance, but with every day of enduring a betraying body, with every year of accepting life as a broken version of himself, with choosing kindness in a world that does not reward kindness. For Grant Hill, greatness was never about standing at the peak the longest. It was about not letting bitterness turn him into someone else. He did not let pain turn into resentment. He did not let being forgotten turn into contempt for life. He did not let loss become an excuse to give up. In American culture, people often tell stories where effort is always rewarded, where endurance finally leads to victory. But Grant Hill's story shatters that comforting belief. It forces the audience to face a much harder truth, that some people are born to carry the expectations of an entire era on their shoulders, yet are never allowed to touch the reward. Some are chosen not to win, but to bear the burden. Grant Hill is not the hero of the standings. He is the living witness to the real cost of greatness when it does not come with luck. He gave America an unglamorous example, one not easy to tell in highlight reels, but more necessary than ever in a society obsessed with success. An example showing that dignity does not lie in how much you achieve, but in what you still hold on to when everything is taken away. When this story ends, Grant Hill does not step out as a mythologized legend. He steps out as a man who walked through his life in honesty, without avoiding pain, without sugarcoating failure, without demanding pity. And perhaps that is exactly why his story lingers longer than victories do, because it reminds us that not every great person is allowed to win. Some are only allowed to endure. And if you live in America, in a society that always teaches you failure is a personal flaw, then Grant Hill's story stands there as a quiet rebuttal. Sometimes you do not lose because you were lacking. Sometimes you simply paid the full price for greatness that fate never let you complete. Grant Hill was not saved, but he stood. And in this world, perhaps that is the rarest and most expensive form of courage. The story of Grant Hill leaves a very different kind of sadness from the familiar American sports tragedies. This is not the sadness of a sudden collapse, but the ache of prolonged erosion, where a person is taken apart piece by piece and never allowed to cry out in pain. Throughout the story, we see clearly that Grant Hill did not fail because of a lack of talent or will. On the contrary, he was crushed precisely by the qualities America once celebrated: absolute discipline from Duke, unconditional sacrifice for the team in Detroit, and the responsibility of successor that the NBA placed on his shoulders right from the 1994 draft. When Orlando promised a dream of redemption, it was the infected ankle, the long antibiotic infusions, and the risk of losing his leg that turned that dream into a sentence of survival. The tragedy did not stop at his career. It spread to his personal life when Tamia was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, forcing two people to hurt together, but neither allowed to be weak, neither allowed to collapse, because if one fell, the family would crumble. The most painful part is that Grant Hill had no funeral for his career, no farewell speech, no scandal for history to remember. He was forgotten while still alive, in exactly the way American culture rarely knows how to honor: a kind, quiet, enduring man. The lesson for Americans from this story is brutally harsh but necessary. Not every effort is rewarded with victory, and not every great person has the right to touch the prize. American society is too accustomed to the "if you try hard enough, you will succeed" stories. But Grant Hill reminds us that sometimes a life's value lies in not betraying yourself, even when everything around you has been taken. The greatest courage is not winning. It is standing when there is nothing left to prove. If the story, full of loss but proud of Grant Hill, made you pause and think, please subscribe to the channel to continue joining us on these honest journeys about the true cost of greatness. Thank you for listening until the very end, and see you in the next video where we continue to tell the stories of people who stood firm even when they were never saved.